Ben, shoot, buddy.
Josh is our resident out-of-the-box thinker, you know? And by the box, I mean the Tesseract. So Josh is the out-of-the-Tesseract thinker. The fourth dimensional hypercube. Okay, we're not stuck in that cube, Josh. We're thinking outside of it.
Man, if I would have heard that joke like 25 years ago, I'd be like, you nerd. Like, and now it's like, now I'm like so fascinated.
Now it makes sense. Now it makes sense.
Well, kind of. Thanks to Josh's help. Yeah.
Well, we've had Josh on before, and we've talked about like dimensions and how they interact and stuff like that. And this is something for me that I'm really into. It is a little bit deeper, a little more like heady. But for me, the concept of dimensions just helps me understand a lot of what's like described in the Bible. And listen, maybe we're wrong. Like maybe dimensions aren't like what God created and how it all works, but just the idea of dimensions helps me comprehend what's in the scripture. So even though a lot of the stuff is going to be like extra biblical and it's just us thinking, you know what I mean? We're trying to make sense of the scripture.
Can you give us some examples, Ben, of that? What is it? How in the Bible does it make sense to you? Can you give us one or two examples of, maybe it might be too early for you to do that right now, but
yeah, I can't think of examples, but
no, you thought of some earlier. You were telling me.
We're going to get right into it. We're going to get right into one example of like a modern terminology or concept is the multiverse. And even though the majority of people, when they think of multiverse, they're not trying to like correlate it to the Bible. You know what I mean? It's usually an explanation away from the Bible. Like, hey, this is another example of how reality can exist without God. You know what I mean? Josh, do you want to give us just like a brief understanding of what, I guess like a secular perspective on multiverse is?
Yeah, so a lot of physicists talk about this a lot, and you're right, it is kind of a way to just skirt around the fact that they don't know what caused the Big Bang. They don't know, that, you know, they're not going to, most of them anyway. There are some Christian physicists and stuff, but most of them, the mainstream, they're not going to admit that there's not even the possibility that an all-powerful being could have initiated all this, but they have a big problem. The problem is, how do you get something from nothing? And everything in science and mathematics, like just everything says that you can't. There has to be some sort of first cause. Another part of the whole multiverse idea is, how do we get around this fine tuning thing without God? So on our planet, everything is structured for life, but we don't see that anywhere else. But it's not even just the earth sciences, and it's not even just astronomy. It's on the quantum level too. It's with particles. If certain particles were just barely 0.00001% more or less mass, you wouldn't be able to get particles to combine into atoms and molecules, and there's a lot of stuff that could get really messed up if the Higgs field, which is what determines mass, the interaction with the Higgs field, if that was just barely a little stronger or a little weaker, if it was a little stronger, the whole universe turns into a giant black hole, and nothing can exist. And if it's a little bit weaker, you don't have enough mass for particles to combine into atoms and molecules. So you wouldn't, either way, you wouldn't have anything. And it's on this razor thin edge of just being the exact right strength. So, and you have this fine tuning in every facet of reality. So to kind of get around that, many physicists now, it's like mainstream now, have said, well, there's actually an infinite number of universes. That's already flaw number one. Just even putting infinity out there, it has problems of its own, which I can get into later. But that aside, what they say is a multiverse. They say that in all of these other universes, there is a universe where the Higgs field is stronger and it's just a big black hole and nothing exists. There is a universe, and we just happen to be on the one where life is sustainable. So for them to be able to have, for them to be able to get around the fine tuning thing, they have to have and this is called the many worlds interpretation of the multiverse. I think it was developed somewhere around in the 50s, the 1950s. And and especially lately, it's been really, really mainstream. Most physicists agree that that's accurate. There's a lot of problems with it, though. It's actually kind of funny. Stephen Meyer wrote a really good book called what was it, like Return to the God Hypothesis or something like that.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, but in there, he talks about how, you know, for a multiverse to work the way that physicists say that it does, you actually run into an even bigger fine-tuning problem, because you need some kind of mechanism that's generating these universes.
Totally.
Especially for there to be an infinite number of them. You need some kind of mechanism. And actually, he said that technically you need two universe-generating mechanisms for this to work, because there's two sides of the fine-tuning argument, and you need one for one side of it and one for the other. They can't both do the same thing. And so those mechanisms, both of them, have to be so finely tuned to create these universes that really you're just kicking the can down the road. It's like when people say, when people try to say, like, oh, human beings were just created by aliens. Well, okay, well, who created the aliens? You know, you're just kicking the can down the road. So that's really all they're doing with this, trying to get around this fine tune. And you know, we as Christians, we know, well, the reason that it's finely tuned like that is because God created it like that, so we could actually have a place to live. You know, isn't that nice of him to do? Thank you, Lord. And so they run into this even bigger fine tuning problem that it would have been easier to explain away without the multiverse, even though you really can't, not within the rules of physics as we know it. You really can't explain the we would say creation, but you can't explain the universe coming into being and expanding and everything happening the way that it happened from absolutely nothing. Like it's impossible.
Is this just theoretical for physicists, or do they actually have like evidence or tests they do, something that leads them to say, hey, this has to be a possibility? Yes,
there are tests, but there's a difference between observation and interpretation. So they do have experiments. They do have things like the double slit experiment. They have which if people aren't familiar, it's just basically what it shows is if a particle will behave a certain way when it's not being observed, but then when you observe it, it changes how it behaves. So when you're not observing it, it acts as a wave. But then when you observe it, they say the wave function collapses. Basically, it turns into a particle. But even that's not exactly what's happening. I'll get into that in a minute. But so there are there's also the Schrodinger's cat thought exercise. That basically, if you're not observing something, this wave is the particle in all possible places that it could be. It's like a probability wave almost, or not almost. It is. It's that somewhere in this wave, this particle can exist, but if you're not looking at it, the way that they kind of describe it to explain a multiverse is it sort of exists in all places at once. That's not really what's going on now. Don't get me wrong, particles are weird. Particles are not little tiny bits of matter like we think of them. They're actually spikes in energy in a quantum field. So particles are already weird. But the difference is we're human beings and we have eyes that function a certain way. Even when we use instruments, we still have to be able to see something to observe it. Well, we need light to do that. Light is photons. You know, it's actual particles. So when we observe a particle, we're adding photons to the particle. Of course, that's going to change how it behaves and change what it does. That's all that's happening with the double slit. And
so we wouldn't be able to see or observe the double slit without adding light to it,
right?
Have they done the test in like infrared or other wavelengths or anything?
Anything you add, you're adding particles.
It's going to change it.
Yeah, and it's gonna affect it because it's already so. I mean, it's on a quantum level, which is the smallest of the smallest of the small.
Right.
And so it's so delicate as it is. Anything you add is going to affect the experiment. So so that's really what this whole why they say like you can't like measure a particle and know its velocity or something like that. Well, the reason is because it's just a limit of our biology. It's not really like a fundamental natural law of how quantum particles work. It's just that for us to be able to see or detect in any way, you have to add some kind of particles to it.
Got it. That's
so
good.
So that affects that affects the experiment. And of course, you get New Agers that take things like the double slit experiment, and they'll say, you know, this proves that you can create your own reality. It's like, no, it doesn't. the thing that the particle doesn't know that it's being observed, and then it like stops doing what it's doing because it doesn't want to be seen. Like that's not what's happening. They don't have their particles. They don't have thoughts.
Right.
They don't know they're being observed because they're not conscious things. It's that we're adding more particles to the experiment itself. So of course that's going to affect things.
That's good.
So that's all that's happening. So you don't need a multiverse to explain that. You can do that in a singular universe. So anyway, but a lot of it is to get around this fine tuning thing. So they have to say, well, there's all these other universes. They also they have to say infinite, which is, and I said that I could. Infinity is totally bogus. Like typically in mathematics, if the answer is infinity, then you did something wrong somewhere. You wrote a number wrong. Something is wrong, and they teach you in mathematics, especially advanced mathematics, that if your outcome is infinity, you did something wrong. There is a mistake because infinity it's physically impossible. It's impossible.
What's interesting, Josh, is there are two explanations for things, which are like everything out of nothing is impossible and defies the laws of physics.
Yep.
And everything out of infinity and chance, impossible and defies mathematics.
Yep.
But they're totally fine with that as long as you don't say the only thing we actually do witness, which is creation.
Yep.
Right? And intelligent design. That's literally the only thing that we actually physically witness that can explain origins of reality.
That's right.
And they're like, no. That's impossible.
Yeah.
It's such a like spiritual blindness.
It's a rejection.
Yeah.
Right? It's a blatant rejection. You got me thinking of something, Josh, while you were speaking, because you said like that the New Agers and all that and how they look at it and how they take this idea. But it comes out of a rejection of God, right? And so anything that if you're going to look at anything and try to form an idea or a speculation on something with a rejection of God from the get-go, it's going to be flawed no matter what.
That's right.
Right. So if you bring it to God and say, okay, God, like shine your light on this, like we want to seek you in this and find God in something, then we can really find truth and find, what maybe, a lot of the keys to this universe that we live in. Right. But, that's why I have a problem with it, is because every time I look at something or hear something new, it's like, well, where's it coming from? Right. What's the basis of that? And if it is a complete rejection of God from the get-go, then, it's going to be flawed.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you think about like how desperate, because you got the most brilliant minds in the world for the past, 100 years or so, let's say, looking at this. I mean, longer than that, but just in our modern history, like looking at this, and this is the best they can come up with. Because for it to work, they have to say that infinity is like a real thing, and it's not. It's a concept that we've come up with, but it's literally impossible. And the reason that we know it's impossible is because percentages exist. And like think about it this way, like, I can have a bottle of water, drink half of it, and say, okay, 50% of it, I drank, 50% is still in the bottle. And it makes sense because this is a finite bottle of water. It's not infinite. If the universe, let's just say the universe was infinite, and no one serious is really saying that anymore, but that used to be a theory. But you can extrapolate this out to the idea of the multiverse. But let's say the universe was infinite. Well, what percentage of the universe does our solar system inhabit?
You can't have a percentage.
You would have to say it would be infinite, because what's 1% of infinite?
It's still
1%
infinite.
is still infinity. We know that the solar system isn't infinite. The Earth isn't infinite. You'd have to say that the Earth was infinite. Even though it seems every year I'm gaining weight, I'm not infinite yet. So,
just wait.
Yeah, I'm working on it. But so you'd have to admit that. Well, you can extrapolate that out to the multiverse. Okay, if there's an infinite number of universes out there, what percentage of the multiverse is our universe? You can't give a number because you're back to having to say that our universe is infinite for it to even work. So it's illogical. Like infinity, you can kind of play with it as a concept, but to actually try to use it practically in real life, it doesn't work, because that's not at all what we observe, and that's not at all how reality works. I mean, so many things would be different. I don't even, if infinity was real, I don't even think you could have life even exist, because there would be so much variety of everything. Like every particle you looked at would be a different particle. You would never have like two photons, because there would be an infinite possibility of particles you could have, and nothing would really repeat. So it's completely impossible. So then some physicists are looking at the possibility of a finite multiverse, but then again, you're back to the fine tuning problem. If you do that, that's why they need infinity, because still, if it's finite, even if it's a large amount of large number, you still have to think, well, then, but still, how is life like that? That's still incredibly improbable that life exists. When you take all of these fine tuning arguments, I forget exactly what it was. The number is so astronomically huge. The chances that this would have happened by chance, you really need an infinite multiverse to even make the argument. Because if it's not infinite, because the way they say it, the way they explain it is basically, usually in movies, it's kind of explained like this: like for every choice that somebody makes, a new universe branches off. So I could have eggs for breakfast, or I could have oatmeal. Well, in the multiverse idea, both of those happened. It's just there's another universe where instead of eggs, I had oatmeal for breakfast. Really what it is, though, that's just kind of the big picture way of looking at it. Really what it is any combination, any movement that a particle could take, any shift in position that one particle could take, it does both movements. So it's like, if a particle goes here, that's one universe. But it actually did go over here in this other universe. So what you would have to do to calculate how many universes there are, you'd have to calculate all of the particles in the universe, and then how much they move, what they do. You'd have to calculate all of those actions. Well, when you take all of the fine tuning arguments, and there are a ton of them, like there are more than we probably even thought of and listed out. I mean, there would be many of these. It equals out to be, it's a greater, the number of the chance that you would need for this to exist. It's a bigger number than what it would be if you calculated all the particles, all the movements, all the possibilities that one particle could move. And even extrapolating that back 13 billion years or whatever they say that the universe is. So you have to have infinity, because if you don't, you still have to explain, but the number's still bigger. So why is it like, and by a lot too, it's not even close. So you still have to explain, even if it is a finite number of universes, why does life work on this one, or even any of them? Right. And they don't want to do that. That's why they need infinity. So instead of which we know is an impossibility. And so instead of just saying, you know what, it's at least possible there's a God. Infinity is impossible. We know that. It's at least possible in the way that we see the world, and in the way that we look at physics, and just by the natural laws of the universe. It's possible that there's a God. But because they don't want to admit that, because if there's a God, that God has an interest in their life, and they don't want to be accountable to something higher than themselves, because they want to live their lives however they want. This is the biggest reason people reject God in the first place. But because of that, they would rather, and again, these are some of the most brilliant minds in the world. They would rather say, okay, maybe we were wrong about infinity, even though anybody can prove that that's false pretty easily. So it's got to be infinity, and they try to jump through these hoops. But that's basically what the many worlds position holds, and I think that's the motivation on why it was even developed in the first place, and why so many physicists really latch on to this idea, and it's just simply untrue.
Well, it's funny that even in this theory, right? For me, the nail in the coffin is, like you said, like Stephen Meyer says, what's the mechanism creating new universes and dimensions and whatever, alternative timelines and all that? Something, it doesn't just happen just because, okay? But even in this theory, the mechanism that people, it sounds like it's your choice, right? So once again, we are God. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
once again, we're the ones doing it.
Very good point.
It's just, there is no other God but me. What a funny way to like look at it, that it's so narcissistic. You know what I mean? And then because the mechanism is there's something that has to happen to create that new reality. So you don't want to say God created this one, but other ones just exist on their own just because we said infinity. But God needs to create it. Even if there are alternative timelines, it would still take somebody to create it or something to create it. What is it? A machine that creates timelines? Like, what is it? You know what I'm saying?
And it doesn't get you away from the Big Bang problem either, because still at one point, even with a multiverse, at one point there was nothing that somehow something came to be. That's hard enough to explain with one universe, let alone an imaginary number of infinite number of universes.
It's not an answer. It's just not an answer.
That's right.
And I recently heard somebody say that people make fun of like the virgin birth often, and they're like, that's impossible. Something from nothing? What are you talking about? And he's like, you believe in a virgin birth. You believe the universe was born out of nothing. Yeah. Right? That's a type of virgin birth. And I was like, oh, that's good.
That is good.
That's
I like
so
that.
good.
I'm using that.
But okay, so you were talking about how in order for this to kind of make sense, even mathematically, it would depend on every single particle and every position that it could be in, and kind of calculating and extrapolating that out. It's a number that's impossible. It's bigger than the particles, right?
Yeah.
However, I do think that there's a way to know all of that. And the way to know that is if you're God.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, the whole reason, I'm glad we brought up that naturalistically, like, the multiverse cannot exist. We know this. It's an impossibility. It's just a funny theory, okay? But we as Christians believe in something called God's omniscience.
Yeah.
Right? Which is that God knows everything about everything, always, forever, every possibility. It doesn't matter. God knows. He can't not know.
Right.
Right? Otherwise, he wouldn't be all-knowing. He wouldn't be omniscient. He wouldn't be God. So God himself actually knows every particle, everywhere in the universe, every position it could ever have, every single outcome that could come from a change in any of those particles, right? That's what God's omniscience is, in my opinion. So that's why, to me, this idea of multiverse, even though I don't think it actually exists and there's a mechanism and it creates new universes and to infinity, I don't think that's actually happening. But I think what we're trying to do, or actually unbeknownst to like these physicists and scientists, what they're actually describing is God's mind, which I want to make the statement, and you'll tease this out and maybe push back on it, shut me down and ruin my dreams. But I want to make the statement that the multiverse exists solely in the mind of God, right? It's not something that he's actually acting on and creating constantly, but that he actually does know the outcome of every possible decision, change, anything, always and forever in all of human history and in all of existence. That's omniscience, in my opinion. You know what I mean? So scientists are like, even though they hate God and they're trying to get away from him, they're describing his mind.
Right.
Yeah.
How ironic, Do you think that that's like a pretty, is it sound logic to say that the multiverse exists in God's mind?
Yeah,
solely?
In the way that we would say, like, there are times when I'm thinking about how I'm going to plan out my day. I'll go through in my mind different possibilities of how that day could work out. And you could say, well, like, in that way, there's other realities that are kind of in my mind. And because we're made in the image of God, we assume that to a much higher degree, but that God would have that kind of thing too. Because, I mean, there are times in the Bible where God will say, if you do this, this will happen. If you do this, this other thing will happen.
Exactly.
So there's a possibility. But I think, and so some people take that to mean that there is literally another universe, like another reality, where so-and-so did the other thing and then got the other consequence. And I will say, like, if we're putting it all on God, and we're kind of getting away from the naturalist side of it, and we're putting it all on God, could God have created these mechanisms and created a multiverse? Sure. Why not? There's, in my opinion, I don't see anything in the Bible that says that he did that. But he could have. Now, all it wouldn't mean that every time it would be different than the way that the scientists are describing it. It wouldn't mean like every time if I have eggs that morning, that a piece of me branched off into this other universe that had oatmeal. It would literally be that there's all these other universes, and there may be people that look like you and look like me, but they would have their own spirits and souls. Their similarities would only be biological. Even if they shared the same exact physical DNA as you, it still would be a different person. So whether that person accepts Jesus or not really has nothing to do with you or your salvation. It'd be a totally separate person.
Yeah.
And that would be like the only way within the rules that we know about, the confines that we know about within the Bible. That'd like be the only way that I think it could work. But I don't.
And then what? Like Christ has to die for sins?
That's
sins infinitely?
Exactly. Well, and see, in this idea, it still wouldn't be infinite. Because I mean, if it was, it would never end. I mean, Christ would always have to die. There would be a universe that's 5 minutes ahead from our own, and there would be infinite universes. There's universes where Jesus won't die for another 20,000 years.
The work is never done.
Exactly. It would be never ending. So the work would never. He would never be able to say it is finished. When Christ died on the cross, he said it is finished.
Great point.
So for that to be true, then it is finished. And so that to me tells me, okay, there's one universe. Now I will say there is another interpretation of the multiverse I do believe in. But before we get into that, even if God created it that way, and even if it was like physically real that there are these other universes, they wouldn't have anything to do with us. All it would be is that there's just more people that God created than we thought. Maybe a trillion instead of a few billion. Who knows? But to your point, so because I've heard some Christians say like, well, because God gives people a choice, that must mean that, and because God is considering it, when God thinks of something, he's thinking like, if you do this, if you do that, then that must mean that somewhere out there's a reality where the opposite actually happened. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because we forget, when people say that, they forget God already knows the outcome.
For sure.
He already knows, even if he's giving somebody a choice, he already knows what that choice is going to be. That does not take away our free will.
He can't not know.
Yeah, exactly. So that other possible reality isn't even possible because he already knows what the outcome's going to be. So even though he's giving somebody a choice, it's really more for our benefit, and it's an exercise of our free will. And that's really what it's about. So when God gives us a choice, it's not like, he's not like, oh, here's a choice, let's see what you do with it. He already knows what you're going to do. But by giving us a choice, we get to use our own free will to serve him or not. And that's true love. If we serve him out of our own choice, that's true love. It's not like if God totally took away our choice and just said, no, you will do this, and we just did it because we're robots. That's not really love.
Right.
That's not, and that's why, I mean, even angels have freedom of choice. That's why we have fallen angels. So the fact that we have a freedom of choice, it's really a gift that God gives to us. So, and then also, because if we didn't have choice, we wouldn't earn anything. Like we wouldn't actually earn anything. We know that, like, when somebody is a good servant to the Lord, he acknowledges that he gives blessings and gifts. But if we didn't have any choice, we wouldn't have earned any blessings or any gifts. So, I mean, that freedom that we have is really a gift. But, the physicists will say, well, every time you make a choice, there's another version of you that made the opposite choice.
Right.
And if that were true, it's like, well, then are we really even making choices? And how could that even really be me? Because I'm here in this universe where I made this choice. Am I also over there, like, at the same time, and just don't realize? See, so it gets weird. It gets weird because if that were true, I would have all these versions of my own spirit, my own soul, some saved, some not saved. Like, how does that work in the judgment? It just doesn't make sense.
And why is it my choice here making the decision for someone else's choice somewhere else? Why is it maybe it's someone else's choice or my other choice in my other world making it for me here? And then it's not even my choice at all.
Yeah. How do you know you're the original one that's making all these alternative timelines?
Exactly. No, that's such a good point. That's why none of this really works, because because yeah, you're right. I mean, it would be just a big giant mess because it's complicated enough to think about that for one person, but to think about all of the billions of people that have ever lived, all interacted, and not even that, but even the way the wind blows, or the way that the waves move,
exactly.
Like it would literally be everything, and it turns into such a giant mess. It's like,
I mean,
God's not the author of confusion.
Right.